What happens when your dream of peaceful country living becomes a nightmare you can't escape? When the idyllic farmhouse surrounded by rolling hills and whispering woods harbors secrets that have been buried for generations? How well do you know the history of that charming rural property you fell in love with? And what forces might still be lurking in the shadows of barns, crawling through root cellars, and watching from the windows of long-abandoned outbuildings? These aren't questions from Gothic novels, but the terrifying reality faced by families who discovered that some country houses come with more than just rustic charm. They come with residents who have been dead for decades but refuse to leave. The Thornfield Estate in rural Blackwater County, Vermont, had been abandoned for over 15 years when the Brennan family first discovered it during their house hunting expedition in the spring of 2020. Daniel Brennan, a 41-year-old software architect, and his wife Sarah, a 38-year-old freelance writer, had been dreaming of leaving their cramped Boston apartment behind and finding a place where they could raise their twin daughters, Emma and Olivia, age 12, in a more natural and peaceful environment. The COVID-19 pandemic had made remote work a permanent possibility for both Daniel and Sarah, finally giving them the freedom to pursue their long-held fantasy of country living. They had spent months searching online listings for rural properties within driving distance of Boston, looking for something with character, space, and the kind of natural beauty that would provide their daughters with a childhood filled with outdoor adventures and small-town values. The Thornfield Estate appeared to be everything they had been searching for. The main house was a stunning example of 19th-century American farmhouse architecture, built in 1847 by German immigrants who had established one of the region's most successful dairy farming operations. The property included nearly 200 acres of meadows, woodlands, and streams, along with original outbuildings including a massive barn, a stone springhouse, a root cellar, and several smaller structures that spoke to the self-sufficient lifestyle of the original owners. The house itself was a 3-story structure with wide plank floors, exposed beam ceilings, and enough space for a large family to live comfortably while maintaining their privacy and independence. The kitchen featured a massive stone fireplace that had been the heart of the home for over 170 years, and the wraparound porch offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains and valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly into the Vermont wilderness. What made the property even more appealing was its price, which seemed almost too good to be true for such a substantial piece of land and such a historically significant structure. The listing agent, Rebecca Morrison, explained that the estate had been difficult to sell due to its remote location, the extensive restoration work that would be required to bring it up to modern standards, and the fact that many potential buyers were intimidated by the responsibility of maintaining such a large and complex property. Rebecca also mentioned, almost in passing, that the property had some local folklore associated with it, but she assured the Brennans that rural Vermont was full of old stories and legends that added character to historic properties without affecting their practical value as family homes. She suggested that any tales about the Thornfield Estate were probably just the kind of colorful local history that made country living more interesting and gave families conversation starters for dinner parties with their new rural neighbors. The Brennans toured the property on a beautiful May morning when the spring sunshine illuminated the rolling hills and the apple trees around the house were in full bloom. The setting was so picture-perfect that it seemed like something from a tourism brochure, and both Daniel and Sarah felt an immediate emotional connection to the place that went beyond rational analysis of the property's practical advantages and disadvantages. Emma and Olivia were equally enchanted by the estate, particularly by the massive barn that still contained some of the original farming equipment and the network of hiking trails that wound through the woodlands and led to a series of small waterfalls and swimming holes that would provide endless entertainment during the summer months. The girls had grown up in an urban environment and had always longed for the freedom and adventure that rural living could provide. The family made an offer on the Thornfield Estate within a week of their first visit, and their bid was accepted immediately by the estate's current owners, who seemed almost eager to transfer the property to new hands. The closing process moved unusually quickly for such a complex real estate transaction. and by August 2020, the Brennan family had officially become the new owners of one of Blackwater County's most historic and substantial properties. The first few weeks of country living seemed to fulfill all of the family's dreams and expectations. Daniel set up his home office in what had once been the estate's library, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and windows that overlooked the meadows where deer could be seen grazing in the early morning hours. Sarah established her writing space in a sunny second-floor room that provided inspiring views of the mountains and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that she had always believed would enhance her creativity and productivity. Emma and Olivia threw themselves into exploring their new environment with the enthusiasm that only 12-year-olds could bring to such an adventure. They discovered hidden rooms in the old house, secret passages that connected different sections of the sprawling structure, and countless treasures in the outbuildings that spoke to the lives and activities of the generations of families who had called the Thornfield Estate home. But as September arrived, and the Vermont summer began its transition into the spectacular autumn for which the region was famous, the Brennan family began to notice aspects of their new home that were less charming and more unsettling than anything they had encountered during their initial exploration of the property. The first sign that something might be wrong came from the twins, who reported hearing sounds in the walls of their bedrooms that seemed to be more than just the normal settling and creaking that would be expected in a house of such age and size. Emma and Olivia had been given adjacent rooms on the second floor of the main house, and both girls described hearing what sounded like footsteps, voices, and even crying coming from inside the walls during the nighttime hours. Daniel and Sarah initially attributed these reports to the girls' adjustment to their new environment and to the very different acoustic properties of an old farmhouse compared to the modern apartment building where they had previously lived. Old houses were full of unusual sounds, and rural settings provided a very different background of natural noises that could seem strange and unsettling to people accustomed to urban living. But as the reports from Emma and Olivia became more frequent and more specific, Daniel and Sarah began to pay closer attention to the sounds that their daughters were describing. What they discovered was a pattern of acoustic phenomena that was difficult to explain through normal means and that seemed to suggest the presence of other occupants in the house who were not visible to the family. The sounds were most noticeable during the late evening and early morning hours, and they seemed to follow routes through the house that corresponded to the locations of hallways and staircases that had existed in the original floor plan, but which had been modified or eliminated during renovations over the decades. It was as if someone were moving through the house according to a layout that no longer physically existed, but which was somehow still being followed by invisible residents. Sarah began researching the history of the Thornfield Estate more thoroughly, hoping to learn more about the families who had lived there over the generations and to understand whether there might be historical explanations for the unusual phenomena that the family was experiencing. What she discovered was a property history that was far more complex and tragic than anything the listing agent had mentioned during their purchase process. The original owners of the estate, the Zimmerman family, had indeed been successful dairy farmers, but their prosperity had been interrupted by a series of tragedies that had decimated the family over the course of several decades. Heinrich and Greta Zimmerman had raised 7 children on the estate, but disease, accidents, and mysterious disappearances had claimed 6 of those children before they reached adulthood. The most disturbing incident had occurred in 1863, when 4 of the Zimmerman children had disappeared during a severe winter storm and had never been found despite extensive search efforts by the local community. The children, ages 6 through 14, had apparently left the main house during the night and had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no clues about where they had gone or what had happened to them. Local historical records suggested that the disappearances had been investigated as potential murders, with suspicion falling on transient workers who had been employed on the farm during the harvest season. But no evidence was ever found to support criminal charges, and the case remained unsolved, becoming part of the folklore and legend that surrounded the Thornfield Estate. Sarah also discovered that the property had changed hands frequently over the decades following the Zimmerman family tragedies, with most owners staying for only a few years before selling and moving away from the area. The pattern of short-term ownership was unusual for rural properties, which typically remained in families for generations or were sold to people who intended to establish permanent roots in the community. The frequent turnover of ownership had resulted in a lack of continuity in the property's maintenance and development, which explained why the house and outbuildings had deteriorated significantly over time and why so much restoration work was needed to make the estate suitable for modern family living. But it also suggested that previous owners had encountered problems or difficulties that had made long-term residence at the Thornfield Estate unappealing or impossible. As Sarah delved deeper into the estate's history, she began to find references to unexplained phenomena that seemed remarkably similar to what her own family was experiencing. Previous owners had reported hearing voices and footsteps in the walls, seeing unexplained lights in the outbuildings, and experiencing an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen presences throughout the property. Several accounts described encounters with what appeared to be the spirits of children, particularly in the areas of the house where the Zimmerman children had lived and played. These spirits were generally described as harmless but persistent, seeming to be searching for something or someone, and often appearing to be confused or distressed about their circumstances. The historical research provided context for the phenomena that the Brennan family was experiencing, but it also raised disturbing questions about what forces might be active on the property and how they might affect the family's safety and well-being. The pattern of previous owners leaving after short periods of residence suggested that the supernatural activity at the Thornfield Estate might intensify over time, or might involve elements that were more threatening than simple ghostly manifestations. Daniel's response to Sarah's research was skeptical but concerned. As a software architect trained in logical analysis and problem-solving, he was reluctant to accept supernatural explanations for the unusual phenomena they were experiencing, but he also recognized that their daughters were genuinely frightened by what they were hearing and seeing, and that the family's quality of life was being affected by the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to pervade their new home. Daniel decided to approach the situation with the same systematic methodology that he used in his professional work, documenting the phenomena that the family was experiencing and attempting to identify patterns or explanations that might help them understand what was happening and how to address it effectively. He began by installing a comprehensive monitoring system throughout the house, using motion detectors, audio recording equipment, and security cameras to document any unusual activity that occurred when the family was asleep or away from the house. The system was designed to provide objective data about the phenomena that the family was experiencing, and to help distinguish between actual supernatural activity and normal house sounds that were being misinterpreted due to anxiety and suggestion. The monitoring system immediately began capturing evidence that supported the family's reports of unusual activity. Audio recordings revealed voices speaking in what appeared to be German, consistent with the language that would have been used by the original Zimmerman family. The voices seemed to be having conversations, asking questions, and sometimes expressing distress or confusion about their circumstances. Motion detectors throughout the house registered movement patterns that followed the routes that Sarah had identified as corresponding to the original floor plan of the house. The invisible presences seemed to be moving through the house according to pathways and room configurations that had existed over 150 years earlier, before multiple renovations had changed the internal layout of the structure. Most disturbing of all were the visual recordings captured by the security cameras, which showed what appeared to be translucent figures moving through the house during the nighttime hours. The figures were most clearly visible on the cameras positioned in the areas where Emma and Olivia had reported hearing voices and footsteps, and they appeared to be children, ranging in age from very young to early teenagers. The recorded evidence confirmed that the Brennan family was sharing their new home with supernatural entities that appeared to be the spirits of the Zimmerman children who had disappeared in 1863. The spirits seemed to be trapped in the house, continuing to follow their daily routines and living patterns as if they were still alive, and as if the house still existed in its original configuration. Daniel's systematic approach to documenting the supernatural activity had provided clear evidence that the phenomena were real and were not the result of imagination, suggestion, or misinterpretation of normal house sounds, but the confirmation that their home was haunted by the spirits of children who had died under mysterious circumstances raised new questions about the family's safety and about their obligations to the entities that were sharing their living space. Sarah's continued research into the history of the Zimmerman family and the circumstances surrounding the children's disappearances revealed additional disturbing information that suggested the supernatural activity at the Thornfield Estate might be connected to unresolved trauma and injustice that had occurred over 150 years earlier. Local historical accounts from the 1860s described Heinrich Zimmerman as a man who had become increasingly unstable and violent following a series of financial setbacks and personal losses. Several neighbors had reported concerns about his treatment of his children and his wife, and there had been suspicions that the children's disappearance might have been the result of domestic violence rather than an accident or external crime. But the investigation into the disappearances had been limited by the law enforcement capabilities of the time period and by the social reluctance to intervene in family matters that were considered private. Heinrich Zimmerman's standing in the community and his economic importance to the local area had protected him from serious scrutiny, and the case had been quietly closed without resolution. Sarah discovered that Heinrich had died just 2 years after his children's disappearance, apparently from injuries sustained in a fall from the barn loft. His death had been ruled accidental, but some contemporary accounts suggested that it might have been suicide motivated by guilt and remorse over what had happened to his family. The historical evidence suggested that the Zimmerman children had been murdered by their father and that their bodies had been hidden somewhere on the property where they had never been discovered. The spirits that were now haunting the Thornfield Estate might be the souls of children who had been victims of domestic violence and who had been denied proper burial and justice for their deaths. This interpretation of the historical events provided a disturbing context for the supernatural activity that the Brennan family was experiencing. The child spirits might not be simply harmless remnants of past lives, but could be the restless souls of murder victims who were trying to communicate the truth about their deaths and to seek justice that had been denied to them for over 150 years. As autumn progressed into winter, the supernatural activity at the Thornfield Estate intensified significantly, with manifestations becoming more frequent, more visible, and more intrusive in the family's daily life. The child spirits began appearing during daylight hours, interacting directly with Emma and Olivia, and seeming to view the twins as potential friends or companions who could help them with their unfinished business. Emma reported having conversations with a girl who appeared to be about her own age and who identified herself as Anna Zimmerman, one of the children who had disappeared in 1863. Anna told Emma that she and her siblings had been hiding in the house for many years, trying to stay safe from Papa, who had become angry and dangerous, and that they were still afraid to leave their hiding places, even though so much time had passed. Olivia described encounters with younger children who seemed confused and frightened, asking for their mother and wanting to know when they would be able to go outside to play. The younger spirits seemed to be unaware that they had died and appeared to believe that they were still living in the house with their family during the 1860s. The interactions between the living and dead children were initially friendly and even comforting to Emma and Olivia, who had been somewhat isolated in their new rural environment and were glad to have companions their own age, even if those companions were supernatural entities. But as the relationships developed, the child spirits began making requests that were disturbing and potentially dangerous. Anna Zimmerman began asking Emma to help her and her siblings find their mother, who she claimed was being held prisoner somewhere in the house by their father. Anna believed that if Emma could locate their mother and free her, the family could finally be reunited and could leave the house where they had been hiding for so many decades. The younger spirits made similar requests of Olivia, asking her to help them find safe places to hide and to bring them food and clothing that they claimed they needed to survive their ongoing ordeal. The spirits seemed genuinely convinced that they were still alive and still in danger, and they were increasingly insistent that Emma and Olivia help them with their survival efforts. Daniel and Sarah recognized that their daughters were being drawn into psychological relationships with traumatized entities that might pose risks to the girls' mental health and emotional well-being. The child spirits' requests were based on delusions and false beliefs about their circumstances, but their desperation and neediness were creating pressures on Emma and Olivia that could become overwhelming and potentially harmful. The family also began experiencing more aggressive supernatural manifestations that seemed designed to force them to pay attention to the spirits' needs and demands. Objects throughout the house were moved or thrown, doors slammed shut or swung open on their own, and the temperature in various rooms fluctuated wildly without any apparent mechanical cause. Most alarming were the incidents in which family members felt invisible hands touching them, pulling at their clothing, or attempting to physically guide them towards specific areas of the house. The spirits seemed to be becoming more desperate in their attempts to communicate and to enlist the living family's assistance with their perceived problems and needs. Daniel decided that the family needed professional help in understanding and managing the supernatural activity that was affecting their home and their lives. He contacted Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a parapsychologist at the University of Vermont, who specialized in investigating reports of paranormal phenomena and helping families cope with haunted environments. Dr. Martinez visited the Thornfield Estate in December 2020 and spent several days documenting the supernatural activity using specialized equipment and conducting interviews with all family members about their experiences. Her investigation confirmed that the property was experiencing genuine paranormal phenomena that were consistent with the presence of traumatized spirits who had died under violent circumstances. Dr. Martinez explained that the child spirits were likely trapped in the house due to the traumatic nature of their deaths and their inability to understand and accept their current state of being. The spirits believed they were still alive and still in danger, which prevented them from moving on to whatever existence awaited them after death. The parapsychologist also warned that the spirits' increasing desperation and their growing attachment to Emma and Olivia could pose serious risks to the family's safety and psychological well-being. Traumatized spirits often became more aggressive and demanding over time, and their inability to distinguish between past and present could lead them to attempt to protect living children in ways that could be harmful or dangerous. Dr. Martinez recommended that the family consider several options for addressing the situation, ranging from attempting to help the spirits resolve their unfinished business and move on, to performing cleansing rituals designed to force the entities to leave the property, to ultimately relocating to a different home if the supernatural activity became unmanageable. Sarah was particularly interested in the possibility of helping the child spirits find peace by uncovering the truth about their deaths and ensuring that their story was told and their suffering was acknowledged. Her research had already revealed much about the circumstances surrounding their disappearance, but she believed that finding physical evidence of what had happened to them might be the key to helping them understand their situation and accept their need to move on. Daniel was more concerned about his family's immediate safety and well-being, and he favored approaches that would remove the supernatural entities from their home environment, regardless of the spirit's needs or circumstances. He felt that his primary responsibility was to protect his living family members, and that any obligations to the dead children were secondary to ensuring that Emma and Olivia could live safely and normally in their own home. The family decided to pursue a two-pronged approach that would attempt to address both the spirit's needs and the family's safety concerns. They would continue researching the historical circumstances surrounding the Zimmerman children's deaths and would search for physical evidence that might provide closure for the spirits, while simultaneously implementing protective measures designed to limit the entity's ability to interact with and influence the living family members. Dr. Martinez helped the family establish boundaries and protection protocols that would reduce the supernatural entity's access to Emma and Olivia, while still allowing for limited communication that might help resolve the spirit's unfinished business. The protocols included specific areas of the house that were declared off-limits to spiritual activity, times when the children were protected from supernatural contact, and methods for the family to communicate with the spirits without being overwhelmed or manipulated by their demands. The protective measures were partially successful in reducing the intensity of the supernatural manifestations, but they also seemed to increase the spirits' frustration and desperation. The child entities began finding new ways to communicate their needs and to attempt to enlist the family's assistance, including manipulating objects to create messages, appearing in dreams, and influencing the behavior of animals and wildlife around the property. As winter deepened and the Vermont landscape became covered in snow and ice, Sarah intensified her efforts to uncover the truth about what had happened to the Zimmerman children in 1863. She expanded her research to include ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property, archival research in regional libraries and historical societies, and interviews with elderly local residents who might have knowledge of family stories or legends related to the Thornfield Estate. The ground-penetrating radar survey revealed several anomalies in the soil around the property that could indicate disturbed earth or buried objects. The most significant anomaly was located near the foundation of the original barn, in an area that had been described in historical documents as Heinrich Zimmerman's workshop and tool storage area. Archaeological excavation of the anomaly site was conducted in February 2021, during a brief thaw that made digging possible in the frozen Vermont soil. What the excavation revealed provided definitive answers about the fate of the Zimmerman children and confirmed the darkest suspicions about their father's role in their disappearance. The excavation uncovered the remains of 4 children, aged approximately 6 through 14, buried in a shallow grave that had been covered with stones and hidden beneath what had once been the barn floor. The condition and positioning of the remains suggested that the children had been killed through blunt force trauma, consistent with beatings that had resulted in fatal injuries. Personal artifacts found with the remains, including pieces of clothing and small toys, matched descriptions from historical accounts of the Zimmerman children and confirmed their identities. The discovery provided physical proof that the children had been murdered and had been buried on the property by someone who had access to the barn and the tools needed for excavation and concealment. The archaeological evidence supported the theory that Heinrich Zimmerman had killed his children during a violent episode and had hidden their bodies to avoid prosecution and social consequences. The children's disappearance during a winter storm had provided him with a plausible cover story, and the limited law enforcement capabilities of the 1860s had allowed him to escape justice for his crimes. The discovery of the children's remains had an immediate and dramatic effect on the supernatural activity at the Thornfield Estate. The spirits seemed to become aware that their bodies had been found and that the truth about their deaths was finally being revealed, and their manifestations became more coherent and purposeful, rather than confused and desperate. Anna Zimmerman appeared to Emma one final time to thank her for helping to uncover the truth about what had happened to her family, and to explain that she and her siblings could finally leave the house where they had been hiding for over 150 years. The child spirit seemed peaceful and relieved, no longer afraid of her father and no longer confused about her circumstances. The other child spirits also appeared to say goodbye to Olivia, expressing gratitude for her kindness and friendship during their time of need. The younger children seemed to finally understand that their long ordeal was over, and that they could be reunited with their mother in whatever existence awaited them after death. The supernatural activity at the Thornfield Estate ended completely following the proper burial of the Zimmerman children's remains in the local cemetery, where they were interred with a memorial that acknowledged their identities and the tragic circumstances of their deaths. The child spirits had finally received the recognition and justice that had been denied to them for over a century and a half, and they were able to find peace and move on from their earthly existence. The Brennan family's experience with the supernatural entities had been traumatic, but ultimately transformative, teaching them about the importance of historical truth, the persistence of injustice, and the power of compassion and determination in helping others find peace and resolution. Emma and Olivia had learned that even the dead deserved respect, acknowledgement, and assistance in resolving their suffering, and that sometimes the living had responsibilities to help those who could no longer help themselves. Daniel and Sarah had discovered that their dream home came with obligations and challenges that they had never anticipated, but also with opportunities to contribute to historical justice and to help heal wounds that had festered for generations. Their investment in the Thornfield Estate had become more than a real estate purchase. It had become a mission to restore dignity and peace to a family that had been victims of violence and cover-up. The resolution of the supernatural activity allowed the Brennan family to finally settle into their country home and to enjoy the peaceful rural lifestyle that they had originally sought. The house felt lighter and more welcoming without the presence of traumatized spirits, and the property's natural beauty could be appreciated without the overlay of tragedy and unresolved suffering. The family's experience became the subject of academic research and media attention, helping to advance understanding of how historical traumas could manifest as paranormal phenomena and how modern families could contribute to resolving injustices from the past. Dr. Martinez used the Thornfield Estate case as an example of how scientific investigation and historical research could work together to help both the living and the dead find peace and resolution. The discovery of the Zimmerman children's remains also led to renewed interest in other unsolved disappearances and mysterious deaths from the 19th century, with researchers and law enforcement agencies recognizing that advances in archaeological techniques and historical research methods could potentially provide answers to cases that had remained unsolved for generations. Local historians worked with the Brennan family to ensure that the true story of the Zimmerman tragedy was preserved and shared with the community, providing education about domestic violence, child abuse, and the importance of protecting vulnerable family members from those who might harm them. The Thornfield Estate became a symbol of how historical wrongs could be acknowledged and addressed, even after many decades had passed. The Zimmerman Children's Memorial in the local cemetery became a site of remembrance and reflection, visited by community members who wanted to honor the victims and acknowledge the importance of their story. The memorial served as a reminder that justice and truth were worth pursuing, even when significant time had passed and when the perpetrators were no longer alive to be held accountable. Emma and Olivia Brennan grew up with a deep appreciation for history, justice, and the importance of helping others who were in need of assistance or advocacy. Their experience with the child spirits had taught them that age and circumstances were not barriers to making important contributions to righting wrongs and helping others find peace and resolution. The Brennan family continued to live at the Thornfield Estate, which became a peaceful and welcoming home once the traumatic history had been acknowledged and resolved. The property's natural beauty and historical significance could be appreciated without the shadow of unresolved tragedy, and the family found joy in maintaining and preserving a piece of Vermont's rural heritage. Years later, Daniel and Sarah often reflected on how their search for a peaceful country home had led them into one of the most challenging and meaningful experiences of their lives. They had gained not only a beautiful rural property, but also a deeper understanding of their responsibilities to history, justice, and the welfare of others who might be suffering in ways that were not immediately visible or obvious. The Thornfield Estate served as a reminder that country houses could indeed harbor secrets from the past, but also that those secrets could be uncovered, acknowledged, and resolved through determination, compassion, and commitment to truth and justice. The Brennan family's experience proved that even the most disturbing supernatural phenomena could be addressed successfully when approached with scientific methodology, historical research, and genuine concern for the welfare of all those involved, living and dead. The case established the Thornfield Estate as an example of how families could work constructively with paranormal phenomena, rather than simply trying to eliminate or ignore supernatural activity. The Brennan family's approach had resulted in healing and resolution for everyone involved, demonstrating that haunted houses didn't necessarily have to be sources of ongoing fear and disruption if the underlying causes of the supernatural activity were identified and addressed appropriately. The story of the Thornfield Estate and the Zimmerman children became part of Vermont's folklore and historical record, serving as both a cautionary tale about domestic violence and child abuse and an inspiring example of how modern families could contribute to historical justice and the resolution of long-standing wrongs. The case showed that country houses might indeed come with supernatural residents, but that those residents could sometimes be helped rather than simply feared or driven away. In the end, the Brennan family's experience at the Thornfield Estate demonstrated that the scariest thing about country houses might not be the presence of ghosts, but the historical injustices and human tragedies that created those ghosts in the first place. Their story proved that with courage, compassion, and commitment to truth, even the most frightening supernatural phenomena could be transformed into opportunities for healing, justice, and peace for both the living and the dead. Have you ever felt drawn to an old country property with a mysterious past? Have you experienced unexplained phenomena in rural homes that seemed too perfect to be true? If this account of supernatural activity and historical justice has opened your eyes to the complex relationships between past and present in America's rural properties, subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the hidden histories and supernatural mysteries of country homes across the nation. Share your own experiences with haunted rural properties in the comments below. Sometimes the most important stories are waiting to be discovered in the places we call home.